Good afternoon. I'm Ann Aylward, Director of the U.S. DOT's Volpe National Transportation System Center. I'd like to welcome you to our fifth event in our five-part series, Up, Up, and Away, Innovations in Advanced Air Mobility. Today's session will focus on considerations for equity in advanced air mobility. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this important discussion and would particularly like to welcome our two guest speakers today, Jolanta Wolfe, Executive Director and co-founder of the Community Air Mobility Initiative, or CAMI, and Okioma Moronu, Head of Global Aviation Regulatory Affairs at Zipline International. I'd also like to remind you to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can later in the session. Under the leadership of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, U.S. DOT has centered equity as a department-wide strategic goal. This is a critical step to institutionalizing equity across the U.S. DOT's policies and programs, with the aim of reducing inequities across our transportation systems in the communities that they affect. The new DOT Project Delivery Center of Excellence, housed at the Volpe Center, recently held an 8-part thought leadership series on delivering the benefits of the bipartisan infrastructure law. One of the key takeaways from the series was the understanding that when transportation systems are designed with equity in mind, they provide fair and accessible options for all individuals, irrespective of their socioeconomic status, race, or location. By addressing disparities in access to transportation, such projects can uplift underserved communities, granting them better connectivity to essential services like healthcare, education, and employment opportunities. Further, when equity is integrated into transportation projects, it enhances overall societal well-being by breaking down barriers and promoting economic development in historically marginalized areas. U.S. DOT's Interagency Working Group on AAM has a subgroup focused on community roles. They are focused on understanding the need for good public planning for these new technologies and issues such as land governance, transportation equity and accessibility, economic impacts, environmental issues, and workforce development. An equitable approach fosters engagement with affected communities, incorporating their perspectives and needs into the project design and implementation. While I am referencing equity considerations related to the delivery of infrastructure projects nationwide, is also applicable to today's discussion and the future of AAM. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jolanta Wolfe, Executive Director and co-founder, Community Air Mobility Initiative. Jolanta is a leader in the innovative aviation ecosystem, an experienced executive and program director with mission-driven organizations. She also serves as a member of FAA's AAM Advisory Committee. Jolanta has a reputation as a leader and a bridge builder with a passion for the human effort to make our world sustainable. She received her Juris Doctor and a certificate in sustainable transportation from the University of Washington and a bachelor's degree in biology from Whitman College. Please join me in welcoming Jolanta.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that introduction. And thank you to USDOT, to the Volpe Center, and FAA for the opportunity to talk with you today about equity considerations for advanced air mobility. Next slide, please. As Anne mentioned, I am Executive Director of CAMI, the Community Air Mobility Initiative. We are a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization, and our mission is to support the sustainable and responsible integration of advanced air mobility into daily transportation needs through education, communication, and collaboration. So we work broadly, primarily with state and local agencies, airports, planners, as well as the public, to educate about advanced air mobility and to facilitate the conversations and collaborations needed to integrate advanced air mobility into our broader transportation system. I'm Equity is a key piece of that puzzle, and so I'm very pleased today to be able to talk about that. Next slide. To understand why it's so important to focus on equity right now, I want to give you a little bit of background as to how we got here. So advanced air mobility has come into our lives through a technology push. So what does this mean? This means that the confluence of technology such as electric propulsion, distributed propulsion, data networks, autonomy, and new materials have driven the development of these new aircraft and aircraft systems. However, what we don't have yet is the market pull side of this equation. And that's understanding what the demand side is. And that is squarely where CAMI fits into this puzzle. We are working at the community level to understand what that demand could be and make sure that it's implemented in a manner that works for communities. So it's very similar to our mobile phones, which appeared in our lives 2 decades ago, and none of us knew that we needed mobile phones, but it was a cool technology, and now none of us can imagine living without them. And we also do so many things with our phones besides make phone calls. So really, this is advanced air mobility is a technology opportunity that communities can consider for future growth and transportation needs. And it is our opportunity collectively to look at what are the needs that advanced air mobility might address and how advanced air mobility might contribute to the overall transportation system. Next slide, please. So as we think about the possible potential benefits of AAM, again, building that demand side equation, in particular in the context of equity, I think it's important to understand that AAM has the potential to bridge spatial, topographical, and built environment gaps, such as water, mountains, and sprawling megaregions. It has the potential to reduce the mismatch between affordable housing and jobs, to expand access to employment and critical services like education and medical, to create new employment opportunities, and create opportunities for economic development to revitalize neighborhoods around vertiports. Next slide, please. However, there are potential community concerns with advanced air mobility as well. These include several in the category of flight paths and en route operations. So for instance, the location and time of operations and how those intersect with the neighborhood characteristics, land use, sociodemographics, et cetera. Air congestion and the tempo of operations will also impact certain communities that are under the flight paths. Noise and visual pollution, of course, are big concerns, and then privacy and increased air traffic over sensitive land uses. In the category of vertiports and aerodromes, some of the concerns around advanced air mobility include environmental impacts of vertiports on, in particular, vulnerable populations and communities. So again, looking at those issues like congestion on the surface and in the air, noise, visual pollution, and air quality. And then social and economic impacts. So to what degree does placing a vertiport, for instance, potentially lead to gentrification and making it no longer possible for the people who live in that community to afford to live there? And as well as displacement. Are people displaced from their communities to bring in this form of transportation? And then kind of more directly, service characteristics. Are these, will this form of transportation be affordable at some level? And is it accessible to under ADA, for instance? And then finally, some cross-cutting issues like environmental justice. Have we used a full and fair participatory process as we did planning? And outcomes. Do we have fair and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens? Or do we have one group benefiting from this form of transportation while another group is in some way burdened? And then the other cross-cutting issue is allocation of limited public resources. So understanding that integrating advanced air mobility into transportation systems is going to take public resources. It's going to take energy, it's going to take communication bandwidth, it's going to take time and resources from state and local agencies. And all of those are limited in supply. So as we pull those resources to implement advanced air mobility, what are they pulling away from, and is there an equitable balance to that? Next slide, please. We work closely with UC Berkeley and their Transportation Sustainability Research Center. They're our academic partner. And a couple of years ago, UC Berkeley did a study of public sector perspectives on advanced air mobility, running the survey past state, city, and regional MPO organizations. And there were a number of questions. This slide just is a snapshot of a small set of questions. But what was clear is that the key concerns about advanced air mobility include equity. For cities, equity was second to noise. For metropolitan planning organizations and state departments of transportation, equity was the number one issue. It is interesting that cities and MPOs were most concerned when it came to equity with affordability and environmental justice, where state DOTs were most concerned with affordability and economic impacts of vertiports on neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the STEPS equity framework that was developed at UC Berkeley and that we at CAMI are using as well. But before I do that, I just want to pause for a second and say, so what do we mean by equity? Because there are many definitions of that word. And in this particular situation, in this particular context, we're talking about the idea of fairness and justice. So whereas equality means providing the same thing to everybody, equity means recognizing that we don't all start from that same place, and we have to acknowledge and make adjustments to imbalances. Before we get too far down the road, I also want to say, because equity isn't equality, doesn't mean the same thing. We're not talking about the same exact outcome for every person, but we're looking at equity at a transportation system level. So what that means is it's very true that not everybody may use advanced air mobility or may use it once or twice. But we want to make sure that as we integrate this mode into a multimodal transportation system, that we haven't created inequities in doing so. And just a quick side note, certainly within the industry, there's a lot of talk about equity when it comes to airspace. And I'm not going to address that. That's not the topic that I'm talking about today. So I just want to set that aside, head that off at the pass. So when we look at the STEPS equity framework, STEPS is an acronym that stands for spatial, temporal, economic, physiological, and social barriers. And these are various barriers that impact equity. So spatial barriers are exactly what they say. They create physical gaps in the transportation network. Again, maybe it's because there are topographical issues or water issues. I live on an island in Puget Sound, so I have water that is between me and Seattle, for instance, or SeaTac. Or it may just be distance and lack of public transit or other forms of transportation within that area. Temporal barriers create gaps in the transportation network during particular travel time. Um, for instance, off-peak hours or late nights. Why is that important? Well, it's particularly important because often the people that need to travel on public transit at that time are people in a lower income bracket who are doing essential services, such as medical or possibly services within the hotel and hospitality industry. They're probably people that live further from their jobs, and they may not have access to a car or easy or affordable parking. Economic barriers include financial challenges. So that's the actual cost of taking that form of transportation. There are also indirect costs. For instance, as we transition to transportation via apps, which is part of that mobility as a service technology, it requires having both owning a smartphone as well as having access to a bank account. And that may preclude some people from using advanced air mobility. Physiological barriers are physical and cognitive limitations that may make it challenging for certain people to use advanced air mobility. And social barriers are social, cultural, safety, and language challenges that may make it more uncomfortable for a potential rider to use a particular mode. Next slide, please. So as we look at all of these types of challenges to advanced air mobility, and as we look at this at the local, state, regional level, it becomes clear that the intersection of airspace access and land use policy is the key to implementing advanced air mobility in communities. The location of vertiports, which of course need to be developed and approved through the FAA from an aviation perspective, also have a significant impact in terms of land use and planning and local communities. So, and that works both ways. Not only is it important that the vertiport does not negatively impact that community, it's important if we're going to put a vertiport that we have whatever regulations in place that we need to ensure that we don't in the future block access to arrivals and departures. So we need to protect that airspace. There's planning that goes with that, that involves both ground and air. So in the context of advanced air mobility, it's very possible that we'll see cities and states and regions develop policies, codes, and design guidelines that, for instance, expand affordability of advanced air mobility, ensure access for vulnerable populations, mitigate some of those environmental and economic impacts, require high-frequency public transit as a condition for vertiport approval, or create conditional use requirements that mitigate impacts. So I think what you see here is that moving forward, we're really looking at how do we integrate advanced air mobility into communities and transportation systems, and what can we learn from the integration of other newer forms of transportation that we've seen over the past decade or so. Next slide, please. So from a community perspective, and this is coming out of a planning guidebook that we have written with colleagues at UC Berkeley that will be published by the American Planning Association later this year. I'll mention a little bit more about that at the end. So communities are going to look at integration through a number of different planning tools like comprehensive planning, subdivision regulations, infrastructure plans, capital improvement plans, and growth policies. And we'll see this implemented through tools such as zoning, building codes, housing codes, conditional use permits, and code enforcement. So that's really, I think, where we are seeing the activity from that demand side. It's first of all, understanding what advanced air mobility can do for the transportation system. And secondly, what are the tools that communities can use to ensure that this rolls out in an equitable way that works with the rest of the transportation system? And the key to that is stakeholder engagement. So next slide, please. So implementing advanced air mobility requires active stakeholder engagement to ensure that that transportation system is sustainable and equitable. And successful stakeholder engagement increases trust among stakeholders and the likelihood of public acceptance. It promotes equity and inclusion, and it supports compliance with relevant federal laws. So next slide, please. Who are the AAM stakeholders? This is interesting. You know, aviation as a form of transportation has operated virtually separately from other forms of transportation, primarily ground, though some water as well. But AAM is bringing together two groups of stakeholders who traditionally have not really worked together, and it is bringing those two groups together that we find some of these touch points that we have to figure out, because we have not done that before, other than those instances where we have airports within communities. But this is advanced air mobility envisions a more diffuse and certainly much larger network than, for instance, even our GA network that we have today. And next slide, please. As we think about public participation, I just used the word public acceptance. I know we use that word, but we have been trying to reframe that in the sense of community engagement. And I will mention the community engagement guidebook that we are just about to publish as well. So what is the difference there? Public acceptance, somebody once said to me, we accept that we pay taxes. Acceptance, the word acceptance has a one directional connotation. I'm doing this and you need to accept that. I think if we reframe the implementation of advanced air mobility in a way that we think about community engagement and community integration, and we think about how we integrate with our communities, we will be much more successful. So the scale you see here is from the International Association of Public Participation, and it looks at different levels of public participation. So often we default to the left side, to informing. This is what we're doing. But as we move right to increasing levels of engagement, we also will be much more successful in how we implement advanced air mobility. Next slide. So I want to leave you with some concluding thoughts before I turn this back over. Transportation is changing rapidly with trends like the growth of shared mobility, electrification of transportation, and digital information and fare payment integration. As a form of transportation, aviation has not traditionally integrated with other modes. AAM brings opportunities to communities, but also integration challenges, including safety and security, environmental impacts, infrastructure requirements, multimodal integration, and equity. So from the user perspective, including accessibility and affordability, and the non-user perspective, including that disproportionality between benefits and negative impacts, as well as its impacts on other forms of transportation. So advanced air mobility implementation requires a transportation system planning approach to assess institutional readiness, including local preliminary scoping that considers a community's visions, goals, and objectives, the goals that advanced air mobility can help meet, the value AAM can bring to a community, the role that it can play in a multimodal transportation system, and the disproportionate negative impacts that may need to be mitigated. Through successful community engagement, we can address potential equity issues before they arise by evaluating the potential impacts of AAM on the 3 levels of equity: social, access, and financial, and to ensure broad, meaningful community engagement in the transportation planning process for advanced air mobility. Next slide. So, next slide. There we go. I'm just going to leave you with our website, which has additional links, including information about our upcoming AAM 101. This is, I think, our 7th time we're doing this. This is a half-day course on advanced air mobility. You can see the agenda there. I also reference our publication. So as I mentioned, we have developed a planning guide for advanced air mobility for transportation and urban planners that will be published by the APA, American Planning Association. It's funded by the Mineta Institute of Transportation. And we also are waiting for publication of a project we did for ACRP, entitled Successful Community Inclusion in Advanced Air Mobility, which contains a primer and toolkit for communities and airports for community engagement. And that is with ACRP for final publication. And then next slide, please. Last year, we completed and NASA published the Advanced Air Mobility Community Integration Considerations Playbook. So this is really an emerging practices playbook that we produced for NASA through workshops with some of the leading state and local entities. And the link is there. I encourage you to go look at that. And last slide, or next slide, please. Finally, I just want to let you know about our Urban Air Policy Collaborative and our cohort program. So through this program, this is a almost 20-hour course that we do for state, local agencies and airports. We've completed 5 cohorts to date. The 6th one will start this spring. You can see on the map the different agencies that have participated. And through this educational process and the collaboration and networking that comes from that, we are building a policy and planning framework for local implementation of advanced air mobility. And with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you for introducing us to the tremendous array of resources. It is now my pleasure to introduce Okioma Moronu, Head of Global Aviation Regulatory Affairs at Zipline International. She is an emerging leader in developing new regulatory approval frameworks that enable high-volume drone operations in various national airspaces. At Zipline, Okioma works alongside regulators, policymakers, and experts in emerging technologies to unlock safe and reliable autonomous operations that will benefit the communities Zipline serves around the globe. Most recently, she was selected by USDOT to serve on the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee. She also serves as the vice chair of the board of the Commercial Drone Alliance. And in addition to her work at Zipline, she brings more than a decade of experience providing strategic advice and legal counsel in the aviation industry. She graduated with a JD from Columbia University School of Law and an LLM from the University of Amsterdam. Okioma, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne, for that kind introduction, and to DOT Volpe Center and FAA for the opportunity to speak to this audience today about such an important topic. So Over 7 years ago now, a small group of individuals got together to solve a problem. They imagined a world where people could get the products they need most, where they need them, when they need them. Whether it's that children's pain reliever at bedtime, the missing ingredient for dinner after a long day of work, or that life-saving blood product during an emergency C-section. The seeds of instant logistics were planted, and today, Zipline is humbled to be the leading commercial drone delivery company. And as a result, many of our customers already live in that world. Impact and equity remain at the heart of what we do. But before I jump into that, I'd like to kick things off with a short video that will give you a glimpse into our operations. This video captures a randomly selected day last August at just one of the countries in which we operate at a national scale. Next slide, please. Thanks, Myrna. As of this morning, I just wanted to check to give you the most updated information. Zipline has now flown over 900,000 commercial flights. That's nearly 65 million miles flown and over 9 million products delivered. That includes over 100,000 emergency blood deliveries and 1 million vaccines delivered, all while reducing the environmental impact by 97% when compared to gas-powered cars. Next, please. So we've been able to achieve these numbers through our operations in 7 countries and across 3 continents. Well, one of the things we really appreciate is that communities may have very differing needs, and there are certainly very different considerations for safely operating in different environments. Whether that's flying COVID tests into Accra, the capital of Ghana, or operating over water to deliver lunches to workers and students in the Goto Islands of Japan, or even getting medication to a patient for our healthcare partners in Utah, we've learned a lot about the opportunities to leverage UAS technology to achieve our mission. Next slide, please. So our mission at Zipline is to create the first logistics system that serves all humans equally. What that means for us is reaching populations and communities that aren't being served by current logistics systems, as well as expanding a quality of service to all communities. Next slide. So I think Yolanda did a great job of sort of setting the foundation for this. In order for us to reap the benefits of this technology, UAS need to successfully address real issues and solve real problems that are being faced by potential customers and users of the service. During my time at Zipline, a couple of myths and misconceptions come up about the customers for UAS services. But what we've found is that there's actually a vast spectrum of use cases and folks from differing demographics that utilize this service through all of our different partners. There are obviously what we're known for, which is the global health facility partners that are delivering life-saving blood and medicines. But there are also our partners here in the US that provide products that allow a single mom to stay home with her kids when they've forgotten diapers at the grocery store, or allow someone's elderly parent who needs a prescription medicine and isn't able to easily get to the store to receive that medication when they need it, where they need it. So during COVID lockdowns, for example, we heard the story of a specific patient who was able to get the chemotherapy they needed because their healthcare provider had access to our services. So this was life-saving medicine that was able to be delivered because of the investment that was made in this technology before it was critical. So as we look into the future, we need to invest in resilient and responsive infrastructure that can meet the needs of the future. And I think to that point, there is this tendency to think of the customers as solely the people who receive the product or the end user of the service. But we also hear stories every day from our partners about how UAS Logistics Services helps them build stronger, more sustainable businesses that provide a higher quality of service and a more responsive solution. For example, what we hear from our healthcare partners is how excited they are to get better health outcomes for their patients. And what our research has shown is that patients are 42% less likely to miss a vaccine in places where Zipline operates. There are also 67% fewer blood products wasted at locations served by Zipline. And one of my favorite numbers is there are 51% fewer maternal deaths due to postpartum hemorrhaging. Those are actual lives saved and families kept whole. So these numbers are not just numbers, and they're not just individuals. These are parents, they are children, they are siblings, friends, colleagues, and that means that the benefits of these services have the potential to not just impact individuals, but to positively impact entire communities that have been traditionally underserved. So while customer stories are some of my favorite impact data points to share, I think it's also important to touch on a number of other areas where it's important to apply an equity lens. Next slide, please. As an integrated OEM operator, at Zipline, we've also learned that we're able to expand access to aviation opportunities along the entire talent pipeline through the way that we hire, train, and develop talent in this emerging industry. We believe that doing this is critical to fostering innovation as we strive to design novel technology and deploy creative solutions that will serve a broader range of society. Said differently, in order to serve people more equitably, we all benefit from having more diverse voices at the table. Next slide, please. So how do we go about getting these voices to the table? On the manufacturing and design side, what we should do is aim to attract a wide variety of talent from a diversity of backgrounds. Yes, it is worth noting that it is critical that organizations that want to design and manufacture products for scale deployment into the national airspace have to understand the existing aviation industry, which has brought us some of the safest airspace in history. But we must also acknowledge that there may be things we can learn from other industries. And there is an opportunity here to open aviation up to a whole new talent pool. The innovation that could come from this interdisciplinary approach would not just benefit UAS, but we expect to be able to develop technology that will be useful across the NAS and potentially even have uses in other modes of transportation. On the operations side, we should also be investing in ways to attract a broader spectrum of people into aviation. We know that traditional aviation has been quite homogenous historically. I believe in 2021, surveys showed that in the US, only 5% of all aircraft pilots and flight engineers were women. About 4% were Black, 6% were Hispanic, and 1.5% were Asian. And unfortunately, these numbers aren't much better on the maintenance side, with only approximately 5% of maintenance technicians being women. So I believe we can and we must do better. At Zipline, what we do is we partner with colleges and universities to create a pipeline of candidates who may not qualify for traditional aviation roles for a number of reasons, whether that's an inability to meet medical requirements or because they lack the resources to receive traditional training. Due to the nature of what we do in drone technology, the automation, and the novelness of the operations, we are able to provide on-the-job training to lower the barrier for qualified, passionate individuals from marginalized communities to pursue careers in this field. We've even started to work with high schools to reach people who may not be on the college path, to educate them about the opportunities available and build a robust pipeline of qualified future aviators. And obviously, it goes without saying that this is not a problem unique to aviation. We see an underrepresentation of marginalized groups in STEM careers and across tech. So organizations like Zipline cannot do this work alone. We also need to see organizations like the Commercial Drone Alliance, which recently launched a women's task force to educate, train, and develop leadership talent, do their part to ensure that we're building this talent pool. We all know that there will be a huge demand for talent as this industry scales, and we can all play a role in attracting the most qualified applicants into this industry. Next, please. So expanding even further out beyond the walls of Zipline and our customers, we should touch briefly on how equity impacts the broader communities within which we operate, both in the air and on the ground. These are our fellow airspace users and the communities that we fly over and into. Let's touch briefly on airspace. As Yolanda mentioned, the airspace is a national resource, and we must take seriously our responsibility to ensure that this resource is efficiently managed to serve the public interest. Small uncrewed systems are aiming to utilize some lower portions of this airspace in a way that can serve a broader population while safely integrating with existing airspace users. I think we all can play a role in ensuring there is equitable access to this airspace for new entrants alongside existing operations. But the thing that excites me the most as a mother and a nature lover is I'm most inspired by the possibility of reclaiming and preserving spaces on the ground for communities, families, people of all walks of life to thrive. Because let's be honest, we as a society have given up a lot of ground to support ground-based infrastructure. So we could envision a future with more parks, safer roads, and bike paths because we are able to move some portion of the logistics services currently conducted on ground infrastructure into the airspace. And what we've seen is that where zipline services are offered to communities, they have a 97% fewer emissions than gas-powered ground-based delivery methods. But what that means is zero tailpipe emissions in that community. So as we consider how to deploy these services at scale, we do have an opportunity here to learn from the best practices across transportation modalities. But we also need to be careful not to replicate and seize the opportunity to potentially even correct some of the mistakes that we made with ground infrastructure. We have to strive to deploy this technology in a way that we must strive not to deploy this technology in a way that benefits a few at the expense of some. Next slide. Oops, sorry, next slide. So these benefits and opportunities that I've offered for your consideration can only be fully realized once we have a regulatory framework that safely and reliably integrates scaled operations into the national airspace. And this, we believe, and we've seen in our experience, will require a whole of government approach to get us there. Next slide. First, I do want to acknowledge the FAA for all the work they've done to ensure that diverse voices are being heard in this process. For example, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee, the BVLOS ARC, on which I participated, was one of the largest to date, with a broad spectrum of interest represented and offered a seat at the table. We've also seen UAS-related requests for information and opportunities for comment receive impressive levels of engagement from a broad spectrum of stakeholders, from GA pilots, interested citizens, to cities, nonprofits, and private companies. I also want to acknowledge the Department of Transportation for forming the interagency working group to develop a national AAM strategy. My understanding is that the purpose of this strategy is to ensure the federal government, in partnership with state, local, and tribal entities, is ready to work with and oversee the industry, including developing new transportation options, amplifying economic activity and jobs, advancing environmental sustainability and new technologies, and supporting emergency preparedness and American competitiveness so that the United States continues to lead the world in aviation into the 21st century. So with that, I would say that I respectfully urge our legislatures, our policymakers, our regulators to expediently take action, not just on the BVLOS recommendations, but also to timely execute against a national strategy that will modernize the airspace, nurture innovation, promote safety, and ensure continued US leadership. Because here at Zipline, we have seen what life can be like when all people, no matter their race, origin, gender, age, or class, are able to get the things they need most, where they need them, when they need them. Next slide, please. So I've tried to highlight what I believe are some real opportunities here if we are brave enough to seize them, to evolve the aviation ecosystem to better serve communities on the ground and in the air through the safer, more efficient, and sustainable deployment of aviation technologies across the national airspace. And we at Zipline look forward to working alongside so many of you in this effort. Thank you for this time.
Thank you. Thank you both for tremendous presentations. We have a little more than 10 minutes for questions. And I'll get to as many as I can. If you have questions and you haven't already done so, please enter them into the Q&A box. Really, this question is for either of you or both of you. Given the costs of developing and building AAM vehicles and supporting infrastructure, it doesn't seem likely that any business case would include an affordable and/or widespread public transportation approach. Most of the marketing seems aimed at ferrying rich people to and from airports or city centers. If this is the case, how is equity upheld to the general public?
I'll jump in first if that's okay with you, Okiona.
Sure.
It's a great question. And I think it is, first of all, it's part and parcel of a technology push market, especially when you're looking at complicated and expensive technology to develop and also a long path to certification. So I think it is likely that the first advanced air mobility operations will be expensive. But what I would say is, again, this is the opportunity for state, local, regional, tribal agencies to set up that framework, that policy, and those regulations to ensure that if advanced air mobility is going to be implemented as a mode in a multimodal system and scaled, that it's done so equitably. I think we very much need demonstration projects so that all of us can get our heads around what this could look like. But for instance, if you look at other forms of newer transportation, micro mobility, you'll see, for example, in LA, the electric scooters that were deployed into areas of higher income demographics, because those were the people who were paying for the scooters, and that's where they were picking them up and leaving them. And the city subsidized the delivery of those scooters to lower economic populations in order to create the opportunity to use that form of transportation there as well. So I think, again, yes, we could end up with just a few operations that cater to wealthy customers who want to go from A to B. But that's not a scalable industry that's going to be profitable in any way. So if this is a scalable industry, it has to be seen as a mode in a multimodal transportation system, and it needs to be done equitably.
So, okay, I'm in two questions which I'll wrap together for you. Do delivery drones currently have no-fly zones like over parks or densely populated special event? And is the goal for AAM to be used for company businesses or for individual family benefits? What are the struggles that are currently underway with air operations with these drones?
Yeah, so I'll speak to the first question. And I'll let Yolanda answer the question about AAM sort of use cases. But drones today are deployed in a way to minimize ground risk to the extent possible, right? So we always want to dynamically route our aircraft in a way that's going to optimize for delivery and minimize ground risk. Let me say that with a little bit less jargon. One of the things that's great about this technology is, unlike ground transportation, it's not stuck to a road. And so maybe flying over a school during the school day is bad, but flying over a school on the weekend might be the optimal place to fly. And so I can't say that we do or don't fly over any specific type of ground, but we do take all of the ground infrastructure into consideration when we plan our routes to make sure we're always flying the safest routes for our customers.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on the second question, which was, I believe, is the goal for AAM to be used for company businesses or individual family benefits? And so let me first start off by saying the term advanced air mobility is a broad term, and it's been defined and redefined many times over the last 10 years. So while it incorporates what we colloquially, I can say that, call drones or the smaller vehicles, I'm going to answer this question to begin with in talking about the larger vehicles. When I say larger vehicles, I mean vehicles that would be capable of carrying a human, whether they're passenger or cargo, because I think there are different parameters for vehicles of that size than those that are smaller. So, having said that, I love the way you asked this question. Is the goal for AAM to be used for company businesses or individual family benefits? There is no one goal for AAM. Again, that's the very nature of a technology push market. There is a technology that has landed here. Now, certain manufacturers, certain operators may have certain ideas for what they want their vehicle to be used for. We have OEMs, developers that are building personal vehicles. We have developers that are building vehicles especially designed for emergency and medical response. We have passenger, we have cargo. Advanced air mobility is not a vehicle, it's a concept. And again, that's why I want to say this is our opportunity to look at that technology and say, what can we do with this? What is our goal that we might want to use that technology for? So, and I think the answer applies to drones as well, though, okay, if you have more to say on that. But you have a range from individual hobby users to delivery to medical and emergency response with small drones as well.
Thank you. So what time frame, and this again could be for either of you, what time frame do you see in the development of this aviation ecosystem and creation of an economically viable system here in the United States?
I've been doing this long enough to know not to speak on behalf of the FAA when it comes to timelines. But what I can say is that Zipline is really optimistic about what the next 12 to 18 months hold. I think what we've seen in the last even 6 to 12 months is beyond visual line operation approvals. We've seen FAA make progress on rulemaking that will enable larger scale drone operations. And we also have, an FAA reauthorization bill coming up. So there is an opportunity for Congress to speak about what timeline they would like to see this happen on. And so I think we'll see a lot of movement in this year. And, drone delivery could be coming to a store near you anytime.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Yolanda?
Yeah, I would just add that I think there are two levels of answers to this. Certainly one is that timeline that's set by the careful process of certification of these vehicles and creating a vehicle that is able to fly. And I agree with what Okioma said. And I, as I said before, I hope we have some demonstration projects sooner rather than later. But when we think about scaled commercial operations of whatever size vehicle, and the infrastructure that is needed from ground infrastructure, vertiports to grid capacity, communications data networks, there is a lot that still needs to happen for that to scale. And so, when I look at your question, and especially economically viable, I don't know that we know the answer to that, but I would say it's probably longer than we think for it to be actually economically viable.
I would concur with that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, which is what tends to happen in these sessions. But thank you both for a tremendous presentation. I would observe, just in closing, Okioma, I was struck by your example from Rwanda, that it may be that application of this technology may differ in different parts of the world. It seemed as though some of what you were describing was almost a leapfrogging of technology in areas where there isn't a 21st century surface infrastructure as a way to deliver people and goods. So just a personal thought there. So hold on one second. Catch up with myself. My apologies. Our next session will be Tuesday, February 6th, 2 weeks from now at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be having a discussion on international collaboration in AAM, and our speakers will be Annie Petzonk, the DOT Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs, who will set the stage for 2 talks by Lirio Liu, Executive Director for Aircraft Certification at the FAA, and Chris Carter, Director for the Asia Pacific region at FAA. So maybe we can ask them about the FAA timeline. Anyway, my great thanks to both speakers, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you on February 6th.